Hi everyone. As we're moving on to the end of the semester, we're going to look at a couple of works from the what we call the later Renaissance period or the 17th century in John Milton, and then something from the 18th century in Jonathan Swift. So we're getting close to the end, but I wanted to take a minute and point out some things for you to look at as you read through Milton's life and you read through the first book of Paradise Lost. If you thought that Shakespeare had an idea of himself as an author, or that somebody like Mephistopheles was an interesting character, even though he's a demon from from hell, Milton makes us really consider those connections between life and work, and also how we might dwell on and think about these biblical images and what they mean. So let's talk for a little bit about Milton and his role. So, as your text informs you, perhaps there's no other author that sought to establish his role as an important English poet and writer than Milton. And if you read his collected works, and it's a massive book if you buy the collection of it, you'll see political treatises, you'll see poetry, you will see all kind of different theological and practical discussions about things like marriage and divorce. He really sought to establish himself as an important figure in not just writing, but also the life of the English government and the well-being of its people. So much so that he was involved in the rebellion that unseated the king in 1660, and then the restoration afterwards. He was a little bit older. He ended up imprisoned at time. And there's a lot of threads there that you can unpack, and so one of the temptations for me as a teacher and for you as a reader is to follow those trails a little bit ways out. We could do an entire class on just Milton and his work. Really, we could probably do an entire class on Paradise Lost, but we want to kind of keep a narrow focus on how he saw himself as a writer of the text. And one interesting part is he creates the argument for book one and the introduction of what he's trying to do with book one as he calls on a muse. Now, this should be pretty familiar to us. We saw Sidney or Astrophil do the same thing in Astrophil and Stella when he says at the end of that first sonnet, "Fool, look to the muse says to him, fool, look in thy heart and then write." We see Milton invoking a muse, except notice who he invokes. It is not just this mythical muse that inspires poetry, it is the Holy Spirit. And so you see the direct connection that Milton is trying to draw between I am in the classical poetic tradition of non-Christian writers, but I view the muse as the Holy Spirit. And that makes sense if you think about the role he's trying to step into. I don't know about you, but it would take a lot for me to presume that I am capable of writing about creation, the fall, redemption, all of those biblical narratives. Like, that seems super intimidating for someone who's a Christian, and you think about Milton and trying to step into that role. And so he's asking for a similar type of inspiration that the prophets would have asked for, and also the Greek and Latin poets. So you see how Milton's bringing all of these things together into performing this role to, as he says, justify the ways of God to men. So we might ask of a book one, right? We're only focusing on the first book. One of the interesting things about the Satan character in this book is how compelling he is as this anti-hero, and scholarship has really dug in on the idea of Satan and what role he fulfills. And is Milton a little bit obsessed with Satan? Does Satan represent some of Milton's anti-monarch leanings, and where do those lines tie? It's certainly Satan is in the same vein of Mephistopheles. For my own personal take about Dr. Faustus, I find Faustus kind of boring. I found Mephistopheles fascinating. And you notice when I ask you questions about who's really in control, and think about Mephistopheles's descriptions of hell, and we'll talk about that in a second. That's a compelling, like, how does his power roll out here? And so you can see Satan in Paradise Lost book one really diving into that same idea. But one of the hard parts about only focusing on book one is that we don't really see how the entire narrative plays out. So we're only going to focus on this specific instance. But if you think about taking a text like this and you present hell with such strong imagery, you present Satan as a compelling rhetorician, does it still follow Sidney's idea of teach and delight? And specifically, how does it do that? And we might, as I mentioned when we first dug into the defense of poesy, that we were going to address this idea on several occasions. How do these texts teach and delight? Or do they? Do they press against it? Do they say no, entertainment or beautiful language and aesthetics, right? Their appreciation of beauty shouldn't always feel the need to delight. It's a question that this text leaves us up to. So if you want to think about that a little bit, I think Milton has an idea. I hope I called him Sidney there. Has an idea that he is teaching and delighting, and that he is thinking through his role as an author, and that to justify the way of God to men. But not everybody disagrees, not everyone agrees with that point. They find Milton a pretty compelling character, as pressing against some of those boundaries that he may have felt. The next thing we might say, we want to think about is, what is hell? So this is a book that in length describes what hell is. Think about the way that Mephistopheles described it as: anywhere that is not heaven is hell. Does Milton do the same thing, or does he provide more depth and more understanding of it? Explore that point if you want to in unpacking some of Milton's imagery. In addition, think about how he describes Satan and the other angels. What is their appearance like? He calls them, he presents them as beautiful in some ways, and that they used to have this grand glory, and Satan to some degree still has it, though it talks about how he is scarred from the thunderbolts of fighting against God in the battle. And there's a really interesting section where Milton unpacks all of mostly Old Testament idols that the Israelites worshipped, or that their neighbors worshipped, and describes these demons as those idols that they worshiped, even though this is all taking place before that time. And so you see the biblical narrative informing this precursor to the biblical narrative. And then think about Satan as a salesman. How does he get the fallen angels to go with him on his journey here? The text says they just fell out of heaven and had to experience the loss of all these great joys. And if you think about that, if I think about that, I'm probably not going to follow again that person that just led me to that space. Yet that's exactly what they do. So unpack that a little bit and think through that, what that means in terms of how well Satan presents his point. Remember that he's the great tempter. And in the same way that he might tempt Adam and Eve later, or people throughout history, is he also tempting the devils in this way? What does he offer them that would make them continue in their rebellion to go after it again? How does he plan to approach this differently? He clearly cannot attack heaven by force. He just got his brow beaten in. So what are his plans now? And unpack that a little bit. So I'm interested to see how you relate to this text and what you think about it and what it unpacks for you. There's a reason why I chose it to come in, not just chronologically, to come right after we have this discussion of Dr. Faustus and Mephistopheles and these questions that begin to get answered about, wait, there's this idea of hell and Satan, but these are tangible images and tangible pictures. How do I relate to this? How do I think through this? What does it make me do in terms of my own understanding of literature, my own understanding of value, of beauty, things like that? So I look forward to reading your comments on this. Hang in there. We've got this text, and we've got Swift's text next week, and then we're going to go from there into a journal article summary assignment that kind of leads you on to the next steps of this semester, or actually the next steps after you would leave this semester. So if you have 25, 30, and 40 as these survey classes similar to this one, the next level will be, how do you think about these texts in the same way that critics do, and how do you engage with their arguments? So I think you'll enjoy that assignment before we head to the final exam. Feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll talk to you soon.